Now, why is this important for us to be talking about today? Why, this idea of like encountering other boundaries and other cultures? Well, it's important for us to just first remember that as Canadians in 2022, whenever we read the Bible, it's like a cross-cultural experience. We are entering into a world very different than our own. And in the book of Galatians, in particular, Paul, who wrote this letter, he's one of the early, first century church leaders. He's addressing issues that are significant to a culture in a specific community. So while the exact issues may not directly relate to our culture, we do believe by looking into this letter and hearing the wisdom of the teaching, speaking to a specific culture, we can actually apply it and learn for ourselves as we live in our own world, in our context. And in particular, what we're going to see is that Paul is addressing a safety boundary for the people of Galatia, something that they are wrestling with. And it's not a physical, tangible boundary like a fence, but it does have significant implications on the lives of the people. The boundary is the Jewish law. So you can see how Paul's using the metaphor of a guardian to describe the law, like a caregiver to keep young ones safe. And he's also saying that time is over. That was the way things were for the Jewish people before Christ came. But now the way of faith has come, and they no longer need that guardian. They don't need a safety gate to keep them protected anymore. And while most of us didn't grow up with a Jewish heritage, living under the sort of expectations and the boundaries of the Jewish law, many of us were introduced to a mode of the Christian faith that had its own version of safety boundaries. And depending on your story and your upbringing and the culture of where you were introduced to the church, things might have been really named and really definitive, particular things that you were supposed to do and things that you were not supposed to do. And for me personally, I didn't grow up spending a lot of time in the church, but I did have many friends who were very devoted to the church with their families. And I knew that they had a different fence around them, keeping them from doing the bad kind of things that, us pagan kids were getting up to, right? So for my friends, growing up in Dalmeny, Saskatchewan, that meant things like school dances, very dicey, pretty much off limits for a number of them. Or even certain celebrations in the community. I remember one particular occasion where my sister was told in no uncertain terms that our family was going to hell because we went trick-or-treating at Halloween. So there's a pretty clear safety boundary that existed for the family that person was coming from. And of course, not all examples are so extreme or so definitive. And let's not be mistaken. Not all those boundaries are bad. Paul is actually very clear in this letter that the law, it was not inherently bad. It's just that a new time had come. It's time for the Galatian people to move on from the hard-line boundaries of the law and to instead embrace the way of faith. And Paul says that we can imagine the way of faith like putting on Christ like clothes. Rather than a guardian watching over us or a fence keeping us enclosed, we are to imagine venturing into the world wrapped up in the ways of Jesus. This is how we are made right with God, not by following rules, not by abiding by those certain guidelines, but by trusting that Jesus restores our relationship with God. Confident that by the Spirit, Jesus goes with us. Jesus is near to us wherever we go, and Jesus is calling us to take up his ways as our very own. And I have to imagine that for many of us who've spent many years in the church, we've maybe experienced this on our own. Maybe you look back and you can see that at times your attempts to follow the rules and stay within the guardrails around you actually created a buffer between you and the world around you. And Paul says At the time for rules and laws that exclude people, those days are over. We are invited to wrap ourselves up in the ways of Christ and enter into our world with a message of hope and love for all people, a message that all people are invited in. See, some people who grew up in those kind of ways I'm describing, around the church, experiencing that kind of barrier and division, for a lot of people, they've actually come to a recognition of like some of that harm, and what's resulted is they've just like kicked down that fence. And they said, nah, that thing is over. They've rejected this whole notion of like division and separation, but in the process, they've also like rejected kind of any reference and any idea that God still rules and that God is still good and that there's something that we also want to still stay connected to in the ways of Jesus. And we just need to be really, really clear here that this is not what Paul is inviting us into. When Paul says that the Galatians are no longer bound by the law, he is not declaring that they're now free of all boundaries. He says that we are to put on Christ. That means that we are called to embrace Christ's ways as our very own. We are called to become like Jesus, to live like Jesus. So yes, we are bound, but we're not bound by the law. We are bound by Jesus.